Welcome to this League of Women Voters Juvenile Justice Study Group. The League of Women Voters of the United States is a nonpartisan voter education organization encouraging informed, active participation in government. It is the League's position that voting is a fundamental citizen right that must be guaranteed, and the Washington County League does not have an official position on today's topic, but provides this forum for voter information. And I'm delighted to introduce Peri Stone-Palmquist to those who do not already know her. She brings a wealth of experience and skills to today's discussion. Peri holds a master's degree in social work and public policy. She was a journalist for many years, and she knows how to tell a story. An active advocate for children and youth since 2005. She's a statewide expert in school discipline and educational rights of homeless children and youth. Previously, she led Washtenaw County's McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Project. She also served as the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the Michigan Association for Children with Emotional Disorders. Peri has been trained and certified as a trauma specialist, and she implemented Check and Connect, a nationwide evidence-based education mentoring model. All of this experience and all of these skills have made Peri a highly effective executive director at the Student Advocacy Center since 2012, a decade of helping our community students overcome expulsions and suspensions from school. How does Peri's work intersect with the study group on juvenile justice? The ACLU's paper on suspensions and expulsions tells us that students who are suspended lose time in the classroom. They struggle academically. They're more likely to drop out of school. We know this. But then the ACLU goes on to say students who are not in school are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, including carrying a weapon. Students who are suspended are more likely to be involved in the criminal legal system, tripling the likelihood of incarceration. So let's hear from Peri on taking action to change this dynamic in Washtenaw County. Please put your questions in the chat, and Peri, welcome.
Thank you so much, Harvey. Always great to be with you, and sorry, I feel like you have to keep hearing the same presentation. So you must really be passionate about these issues. So grateful for our friendship and collaboration over the years. Is it okay if
6 grandchildren make it real for me, and yeah. I'm lucky enough that they're not challenged in school, and so the work that you do is just fabulous.
Thank you. Is it okay if I share my screen? Okay. And as some of you know, I have a little bit more time than I initially, let's see, is that working? Cool. Mm-hmm. Thought, so if we have time after, there's a story that I could, from one of our students who was expelled in 8th grade that I'd love, if we have time, I'm happy to share it. We'll see how many questions people have. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay, great. So yes, I'm Peri with Student Advocacy Center. For those who haven't heard of SAC, we've been around since 1975. We were founded in Ann Arbor, actually, by members of the NAACP and just concerned community members. Our founding executive director is Ruth Zweifler, if that name is familiar to some of you. And today we have offices in Ypsilanti, Detroit, and Jackson. We have a statewide helpline. Last I checked, which was maybe yesterday, we have served 580 students through that helpline, more students who have ever served in 1 year through the helpline in our year history. So we're here helping students who are struggling. We provide advocacy, mentoring, and I've been working on community organizing and youth organizing as well, trying to build an education justice movement with the Michigan Education Justice Coalition. So that's us. You already learned about me more than you probably wanted to know. Today we're going to talk about expulsion, expulsion prevention legislation that's been introduced, and we're trying to get a hearing on it, of course, trying to get it passed. And I'm also going to at the end, sort of give you some suggestions just locally what you can do while we're waiting for the education committee to actually take up a whole host of bills that are just sitting there, not going anywhere. So just for a little bit of background, in case you don't know, I have to get used to saying 5 years. I keep saying 4 years, but it took effect in 2017. Michigan finally overturned zero tolerance in Michigan, or in the state, yeah. Our students were there. They marched from Detroit to Lansing. They demonstrated on the Capitol lawn. For years and years, we had been kind of sounding the alarm because Michigan had one of the harshest school discipline policies and codes in the country. And so this law didn't go quite as far as we would have liked it to, but it did give districts more flexibility. And instead of saying you must expel, it actually said, the default should be that you're not suspending and expelling because we know how damaging that is. And instead you are required to consider restorative practices as an alternative to suspension or expulsion, and you are required to consider 7 factors. And I won't name all of the 7 factors, but it's things such as age, whether or not you have a disability and the way that contributed, how serious was this offense, and would lesser interventions work? That's kind of the most important. Would an alternative work? And I always like to say there's 179 alternatives to 180-day expulsion. So there's lots of alternatives, and we have a long history of helping. I'm joking because it's certainly more complicated than that, but there's lots of ways to address misbehavior in school, right? So unfortunately, we haven't seen kind of the shift that we were hoping to. So I know this is a lot of numbers, so don't stress about looking at each one, but you sort of see the first year of implementation here, 2017, 2018, we did have quite a drop down, and then it's kind of held steady, and then it's kind of hard to evaluate because the pandemic happened and our students stopped going to school in person. So we had a little bit of a respite from discipline, but it's back this year, I can promise you that. But the rate, even the year of the pandemic started, the rate per physical school day that they were present crept back up. And I'm quite, I don't know if eager is quite the right word, but I would really want to see what the data is going to show this year. And perhaps, I mean, I know in a lot of the cases that we've been successful in averting expulsions, but we certainly had a lot of young people put up for expulsion and having that threatened to have school taken away for them. I think the other thing to note about this data, and just data and about discipline in general in Michigan, is this doesn't include removals of 10 to 59 days. And when the laws changed 5 years ago, they started defining expulsion and long-term suspension by the number of days. So all of a sudden, the definition of expulsion was 60 days. And the next, right when that went into effect, we suddenly, for the first time ever in our history, started seeing 59-day removals. So that wasn't considered an expulsion, it's a long-term suspension. And that data isn't reflected here. And we don't have data transparency around long-term suspensions or short-term suspensions. It's quite hard unless you want to look up each individual school and get a combined measure. It's really hard to get a sense. And the other thing, which I'm going to talk about today, is we are seeing many, many more children being unilaterally placed in virtual school. So if any of you have children or grandchildren that had the experience of virtual school in the pandemic, most people that I know will at least have had one kid who really struggled. I had one kid who struggled socially, and then the other who just struggled in all domains, and we would never want to go back to that year. We were just reflecting on that last night, because this year has been so much better for our 15-year-old boy. Like it was bad. And my husband was in the exact same room with him, and he'd have to like use his Nerf gun to get him to stop watching The Simpsons, or I don't even know what he was doing. And I was like, that's right, my job is school engagement, and my own son is like truant from school. We don't know what's going on. It was rough, but that is what we are seeing. Unfortunately, there's been an expansion of school districts themselves having virtual programming. It rose for a good reason, for a public health crisis, and now it is being used with absolutely no due process often. And kids who are really struggling are being forced into these programs for academic reasons, for behavioral reasons, sometimes for truancy. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's what those numbers are showing you. So the other things that we're seeing, this is before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after, that students, not after, we're not after, current, hopefully we'll be after. Students are being pushed out and removed from school without what we would consider basic due process protection. So right here in Washtenaw County, we are seeing delayed or no formal meeting for a chance for the student to be heard. So like I said, students are being put out of school. Sometimes the hearing is on the 30th day. We've seen it on the 40th day. We have seen students have no hearing at all because they're just being placed into these virtual programs. That's happening right here in Washtenaw County. We see sometimes, this is not in Washtenaw County, I wouldn't say, but hearings without students present. There was a hearing this year where the student was in the psych ward. They didn't delay it, they didn't wait. You can't hear a student's voice if they're not there. So that's pretty problematic. Hearing officer is not always impartial. And there's an undefined appeal process. And the other thing I'll say about that is actually more than ever this school year, we're seeing that there's absolutely no appeal process. So we had, I think, about a 5th grader who was expelled from a charter for, you know, those safety scissors, like you could poke yourself and they wouldn't even, like, it wouldn't leave a mark, right? And he was getting bullied and they kept saying, we're going to fight you, we're going to fight you. And he picked up the scissors and put them in his pocket. And when they came up again out in recess, he chased them around with it, never made contact. He was expelled for 180 days. And there was no appeal. There was nothing he could do. That was it. That was a public school academy in Wayne County. So it's problematic when we have these kinds of situations where they can't even, they can't appeal. And then that 7-factor consideration that I was talking about often isn't happening at all, or it's a cursory it's a cursory checklist. And often the parent doesn't have, or the caregiver doesn't have any, or the student don't have any invitation to what that might be. And I always find that our young people have really good ideas about what lesser interventions could be. And so they really should be invited into that process. Right. So the impact, and if you want to get deep into stats, I have another sheet up that I can pull up if you are into that later. But as Harvey sort of mentioned, what we know over 20 years of really high quality research is that suspension and expulsion increases school failure. It actually increases absenteeism. And there's been some work done even in Michigan to look at that kind of connection. It becomes a sort of self-feeding cycle, certainly increases dropout, criminal legal involvement. Sorry, I have dropout in there twice. It's so important, I put it in there twice, and suicidality. And there's been some more recent research coming out about that, which has been interesting and quite sad. And I actually just had a call from a grandfather and a father whose child took their life after being removed in 2019. And, you know, it's one thing to read that stat, you know, on a journal or something like that. And certainly I've seen it play out where people have struggled. I've had young people, and we've had more suicidality the last 2 years than ever before with our young people, or thoughts of suicide. But you know, to talk to a parent who lost their child after getting interrogated by their principal and kicked out and not feeling heard, that's quite heart-wrenching. And I don't know what to do to help them other than to listen. And but I don't think we talk about that enough. And our young people's mental health is extremely fragile right now. Even young people who have all the resources in the world are really struggling. And certainly our young people who don't have all the resources in the world are struggling as well.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is this the same for students with special needs?
Is the suicidality or just in general?
Just in general, what's happening?
Yeah, thank you. Students with disability, of course, are removed more often. And we know they're incarcerated more often and put into the system more often. So yeah, thanks, Harvey, for lifting that up. And often we see young people who maybe haven't been formally identified as having a disability yet. We know behavior is communication, and school districts, when there is a misbehavior, should be looking, does the student have a disability? Is that what can explain some of this behavior? Not always, but we have definitely had situations where there's been significant mental illness or things like that going on for a while, and there hasn't been any, real response for a variety of reasons.
It was actually Mary Ann's question, and she has a follow-up.
Oh, sure.
Thanks. What I'm wondering is, with the kids with special needs, they're subjected to the same kinds of expulsion as you presented in the earlier slides. The removal from school for 59 days or 60 days. Is there nothing in special ed regulations that mitigates against that?
Thank you. You've just convinced me I do need to put a slide in specifically about this, because even longtime educators ask me this question. So that stat is a fact. Like, students with disabilities are disproportionately suspended and expelled. And yes, that is true. And they have protections. And apparently those protections are not enough. So there is, before a student with a disability with an IEP, an individualized education plan, is expelled from school, they have to have a special meeting at the school district called a manifestation determination review, an MDR. Don't you love all the acronyms for education? So that meeting says, or asks the question the team has to ponder, does this student, was this behavior directly related to the disability? Was this behavior due to a lack of support services that were in the IEP? So those are the two questions. But I'll tell you a couple of the common situations we see is they don't really conduct those correctly, at least according to what the guidance from the state and the feds tell us. But for instance, a student has a learning disability. There's tons of research that if you have a learning disability, it actually affects your social emotional functioning. But if that hasn't been captured in some way, what we see those teams doing is saying, well, that's a math disability. What does that have to do with this? And so then they go up for expulsion. So it's those sorts of things, like that behavior, that was a choice. So that doesn't have any impact. Yeah, so that's what we see happen. We hear those words a lot. This was a choice, or they knew better, or that wasn't impulsive. So it is a protection, it's there, but it doesn't often result in, but I will say, if you have a disability and you're expelled, you are supposed to have some level of services. You're supposed to have a free and appropriate public education. Too often, if the family doesn't have an advocate, what that looks like is 2 hours of instruction a week, which is, of course, completely inadequate when you're talking about any student, especially a student with disability. So I hope that answers your question, and happy to revisit. And thank you for reminding me again that I need to add a slide about disabilities in here. The impact isn't just on the young people with the behavior. And there's been some interesting studies that show that a lot of suspensions in a school can actually negatively impact the school climate and feelings of safety for all, and actually even the academic achievement for all the students, because you have students coming in and out, and that's a lot for the teacher to navigate. Obviously, if you're also not addressing behavior, not addressing school climate, and you're just letting kids do whatever they want, on the other extreme, that's also going to negatively impact school climate. So I just wanted to lift that up, because sometimes people hear me and they think I'm saying that kids shouldn't be held accountable. And I'm like, yeah, I'm a parent. Like, our job is to teach young people, not just to let them do whatever they want. That's not okay either. So I just think that's interesting. A lot of people don't know or don't consider the fact that I don't want I don't want my children getting punched or hurt or bullied in school, but I also don't want them in a school where the children are just disappearing or coming in and out because of removal, because we're not able to address and get to the root of the issue with those young people. And Harvey's heard me say this many times. I've done, before I came to Student Advocacy Center, as part of my graduate school research, I interviewed young people who had been expelled about their journey. And what I found then has been reinforced so many times as I talk to these families over the last actually probably 15 years as a youth advocate, and they experience removals as rejection, period. And so just think about how you feel when you feel rejected. You're not your best self. You're making maybe poor decisions. There's a lot of shame with the parents as well. And so this is a big deal. And so we want to do whatever we can to thoughtfully reduce suspension and expulsion, because it has such a huge negative impact. And so with that in mind, we have been working with Senator Jeff Irwin and others, Felicia, Representative Braybeck in the House for these 3-bill package that seek to reduce removals and protect students and define due process for these students. And so the bills, these are the protections that are proposed by the bills. So one is having that hearing within those 10 days of removal unless the family requests a delay. Having a hearing for a removal or a placement to an alternative setting for disciplinary reasons. It's interesting, by the way, I'll just say this because I think in other states, suspension and expulsion doesn't just mean you're kicked out. It actually means that you're being placed into an alternative setting, but you have to have a hearing before you do that. In Michigan, it just means bye. I don't know. I don't understand that, but so we have to spell this out. It would require districts to have an independent impartial hearing officer and an avenue for students to appeal disciplinary actions in their district. And then it sets a level at the ISD level, and it sets an appeal at the state level as well. So students would really have an opportunity if there was an egregious situation. And I should say that most of these, especially 1, 3, and 4, well, part of 4, are already happening in most school districts, because so this is sort of what we hear. Well, we're already doing that. Great. What about all the school districts that aren't doing that, or they're doing it 1 year and then a new superintendent comes and they stop doing it? And so those are the kinds of things that we've seen. So many of these things, for instance, Ann Arbor does, and other school districts in our county don't necessarily always do them. Yes, I see a question, Carolyn. You're on mute.
Just wanted to mention that as we speak, last night at the state advocacy, yesterday at the state advocacy of the League of Women Voters, we approved these bills to move forward to go to the board, the state Michigan League, state league. And they will I think they're going to meet on Saturday. I don't know, Lynn, if you know if they meet on Saturday or not. And that to approve these boards. Usually what the advocacy puts forward, the board will approve, but I can't say that for sure yet. So, and I just wanted to correct that. I think we do have positions that speak to these issues, and they are in the support form that we sent to the state advocacy. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted everybody to know that. I think that's exciting that we're doing that.
Oh, that is very exciting. Thank you so much. Yeah, we really appreciate it. I mean, to me, this is a very nonpartisan issue. So, okay, and then here's the other provisions of the bill. So strengthen those 7 factors. So you'd have to have that, make sure it's documented, and make sure that student and family input is documented. We are adding 2 factors. So it wouldn't be the 7 factor in our dream world. It will be the 9 factor consideration. And we added a consideration of homeless status, partially out of some research that happened at the U of M Poverty Solutions, which showed that homeless students and formerly homeless students, even very young homeless students, are being disproportionately suspended and expelled. And that's happening right here in Washtenaw County, especially with the suspensions. So really wanting to be more intentional, and frankly, like federal guidance already says this should be happening. It just isn't. There isn't the mechanisms to make sure that those connections are happening. As someone who spent 7 years at the ISD working only with homeless families around their education, this is pretty exciting, and I hope it happens. But regardless, we've been having some good conversations with school districts of ways they could implement this voluntarily. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And then adding this 9th factor, Harvey mentioned that I received training a while ago now as a trauma specialist. And so trauma has become a bit of a passion for me, and could probably talk about it for a long time. But we want to add a 9th factor where we're really considering as a school district, is this an expression of past trauma, stress, adverse childhood experiences? Our young people go through so much. Homelessness, I think, is a trauma of it in and of itself, but divorce, violence, our young people in IPSI, some of them have witnessed just really serious violence, gun violence, and they've seen young people shot right in front of them. We just got a presentation recently by Derek Jackson at the Sheriff's Department, and he had been consulting with some folks in Detroit, and where there's a fair amount of gun violence as well, but they said, wow, like it's so contained, IPSI's so small, there's really nowhere to go. And so it's just a lot of exposure in a condensed area. And so just want to lift that up, because I think a lot of you maybe live in Ann Arbor and maybe you're not aware of that, but I live in IPSI. I'm like the towers right over there, and there's been shootings. I feel safe, I'm not saying that, but there's been shootings not that far from my home, and I feel very safe actually. So just want to say that, but there is gun violence that is happening with our young people, and it has ripple effects that affects them for years and years and years, and we should be thinking about the ways that all these adverse childhood experiences, domestic violence, things like that are showing up. And what are we doing to get to the root cause and really help these young people heal, instead of just kicking them out, which exasperates feelings of loneliness and things like that. And then the last thing is, seems so common sense to me. I really don't even understand why this is an issue here, but expanding accountability through discipline data. So if you read any best practice about how to improve discipline, you need to be like tracking it. In some districts, I think Ann Arbor, I'm not sure if IPSI's looked at that recently, but they used to look at it quite regularly. If you want to see if you're doing better, you have to measure it. And we believe you should be doing that. The school board should be monitoring that. And we also think you should be looking at that with these different categories: foster care, English language learners, economic status, disability status. And really that's going to help you like continue to improve if you're looking at the data. And districts are doing it voluntarily, but they aren't required. Yet we're giving them money to educate students every day. So just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know what I'm missing. And so when we're talking to students and families, we say, these are bills that will give them an opportunity to really speak about what happened. And that's part of what we do as our job at SAC, is we help families prepare and really reflect on the incident and think about how they might repair the harm. I've been trained a lot in restorative practices. So we use restorative questions with our young people, have them practice and role play, and they're often very nervous, of course, because these are pretty formal hearings, but then they're able to really speak for themselves and talk about what happened. Families should get advance written notice. They should have a right, it should be explicit that they have a right to an attorney or an advocate during the hearing. Thankfully, we've never had an issue. I at one time had a private school and I wasn't allowed to speak at that hearing, but this doesn't address private schools, but we figured we might as well have that documented in there so that we won't have a problem in the future. And then here's a big one: access to missed assignments and exams and other needed and available services. So there's this period of time, right? Like you're out of school and you're waiting for the hearing to happen and you're falling behind in school. And so even a week, if you're missing a week, you're missing sometimes really important stuff depending on what it is. And so that's really asking school districts to kind of step it up and make sure that those young people are getting the services that they need while they're awaiting hearing. So these bills have dropped in the House and the Senate. when I either maybe Harvey, you can put the link if we're allowed to do that in the chat. And if you want to request, we're trying to request a hearing on these bills, then you can do that. And we're hoping that that will happen. At some point, we're going to keep asking. And then if we have to get the bills reintroduced, we'll do that. So before I move to what we could do locally, I just wanted to see, and I can go back to any of the slides. Are there any other questions about the bills themselves before I move on?
There are two questions. There are three questions in the chat. Mary Ann wanted to know if you have a statistical breakdown by gender, race, breakdown by offenses, examples, truancy versus fighting. Lynn wanted to know what strategies schools have implemented that are making a difference, best practices that show more success, how do schools get the resources to implement these good strategies? And there's admin and teachers care deeply. How might we start in kindergarten to help educators learn dispute resolution restorative circles in class or outside of class?
Okay, cool. And I have them in front of me, which is good because I'm a visual person. So breakdown by gender, race, and offense. If you want to email me after, I can show you for expulsions only there. I believe all of those things are on there. We're not seeing expulsion for truancy. I know that that was a concern, and they actually like drafted some legislation to say that you shouldn't do it, and the legislation didn't pass, but we really haven't seen that anytime recently. I'm not sure I've ever seen it locally. I'm trying to think. But anyway, if I have, it's been a really long time. So that's truancy isn't an issue, but certainly the other things. And what you'll see is that there's a lot of like other for expulsions. But so yeah, so I'm happy to do that. I'm interested in what strategies. Okay. So I think the cool thing is really Ann Arbor is a great example, and I'll use it. I use it all the time, whoever I'm talking with. But since a lot of you are from Ann Arbor, it's even a better example to use. And I think one of the things people always wonder is, do we need all these special programs or trainings? And, you know, I'm happy to talk about those because I think that there's things that can be really helpful in behavior and understanding behavior and trying to create good climate. But here's the thing. What I really see is like, does the leadership want to do things differently? Like, are they willing to say, we don't believe you should expel kids? That doesn't make any sense. No, you're not doing that. And that doesn't mean that suspensions are still happening in Ann Arbor and disproportionately to Black boys. The stats will show that. But in terms of these long-term, there's just no good reason to do it. You don't need a special program. There's all sorts of lesser interventions that you can do depending on what the offense is. And so we always say school districts, if you're really stuck on that, feel free to call us. But we also have a tool on our website that we share and encourage school districts to download and personalize for their district to have a plan. I think when I talk to Ann Arbor and would ask them, you know, what are some of the things that you've done that you think have really helped with discipline? I'm sure that they would say their peer restorative work in Skyline High School, which is such a model. I imagine that takes quite a few resources to do. And I haven't heard how that's going this year, but I've certainly heard in the past what a great way to, like, on the ground, the kids can like resolve conflict before it gets too big. And so that's beautiful, not to mention it teaches kids a really important skill in conflict resolution. And I just think that's such a beautiful program that Dispute Resolution Center, and maybe some of even you have been involved in. I know that they've hired quite a few behavior specialists, or I always encourage more general education social workers in buildings that can really work with students. One of the things often that we recommend with kids who have more extreme behaviors is these check-ins, check-in and check-out, which sounds so simple, but a lot of times it's this lack of connection that can lead to this behavior. Whereas if you're really connecting with that student every day and getting a barometer of where they are, what happened last night, you can better support them. all that being said, this year has been so hard for our school districts because of a lack of school staff, and hiring has been so challenging. So I think this year, I think our numbers are going to skyrocket because we had both extreme behavior from kids who weren't being socialized properly for a year and a half. And then we had stressed teachers. That's not a good combination. So I think this year was nothing we could have predicted or understood or whatever. And I'm hoping our teachers all have a really restful summer and that we can hire more people. Because I think part of it is having the people power to really be able to respond, especially when you're talking about some of our lower income districts with fewer resources and where there's more challenges happening. So I hope that answers that question. I could probably do a whole training. In fact, I do whole trainings on things that can be done, but I'll just mention this other thing besides the restorative. I really think doing more work around trauma and creating classrooms that, and part of it's doing classroom circles, because that's building that. It's having chill out spaces in your classroom and in the school. It's really working individually with young people and having them understand their own triggers and what to do about that. I remember one young person we were working with was like, I need to go to the bathroom and splash water on my face. Well, I wouldn't have known like that, but she figured that out. And maybe after a while it doesn't work and she changes her plan, but really teaching our young people about what triggers are, and then like, oh, it's okay, everyone has triggers. It's just about how you handle the triggers, right? Okay, so I could go on and on about that. What was the last one? Admin and teachers care deeply, for sure. How about we start in kindergarten to help educators learn? Yes, well, yeah, you just said what you should do, which is do restorative. And I think elementary school, you actually can. And I think many schools have started this, but you start every day with a circle where you're really trying to build everyone's ability to listen and take turns with the talking piece and build relationship. But what also eventually you can do, because you get past the honeymoon phase pretty quick. And then when a problem bubbles up in your classroom, you can use that circle and say, I have noticed that we're having a hard time during this time every day, and we're all talking a lot, and I can't even hear myself think. And what do you think we should do about that? And then so really, like, kindergartners can come up with a lot of solutions. That's what I'm saying. So that's what I would say, starting right away, doing those circles.
I was thinking also that if you start in kindergarten, the skill becomes ingrained by first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh onward. It's in that student's repertoire if it's used every single year. So I'm all about teachers coming on board with this. And I'm not sure how much or how many school districts you work with, but and you have talked about Ann Arbor. Could you talk about IPSI and where they're at the present moment? I know your office is in IPSI, you live in IPSI. So with regard to IPSI schools, can you talk about whether these restorative practices are started early and whether they continue, or are teachers just so overworked and overburdened and rushed and the easiest fix is to suspend somebody? So that's more where I was going with that. And I have more to say, but I'll stop. It's your turn.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about IPSI. IPSI, when the two districts combined, they really made a commitment to restorative practices. There's a Grizzly Center at the high school. I know some of the elementary schools are doing it. My daughter went to Wise, and it was something they had a restorative person there. I don't know where everything stands like this moment in each building. And they've also done a lot of training about trauma and how that lives in the body and like the kinds of things that you can do about that. What else was I going to say about IPSI? Oh, the other thing I wanted to say about IPSI, which I wish every district would do, is several years ago, they actually, it was actually before the laws passed, they brought teachers, parents, myself, community mental health, they brought some students, they brought us together to work on the code of conduct. And we started with what are our values? And so we actually talked about the data and the research, and we kind of stated what our values are as a school district. I just always lift that up because that's the thing, right? What we have to talk about our values, because what tends to happen in school districts, especially after something like Oxford, is you get certain parents who are like, lock every kid up. Like literally people were saying that after Oxford. It was like, I couldn't even like read the paper because it was so disturbing to me, like how we were talking about young people. And I've heard that so many times, not as much in IPSI, but in different school districts, we have to kick this kid out because there's so much pressure from the parents. And so I think it's really important for those of us who believe in restorative practices, you know, who believe in like love, to talk about those things and how do we live that out in the most supportive way possible. So I don't know if that totally answers your question about IPSI, but they also, yeah, are doing a lot of work and have a lot of values around trying to keep kids in. They also removed police from the schools a couple of years ago. So lots of good work happening, and more, still more that needs to happen. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk this last slide and then happy to answer more questions. But we are really trying to encourage folks, because we only have so much capacity at SAC, but really encouraging folks to go to their local district and ask them to voluntarily adopt some of these provisions that are going to be in the laws. So so questions you could ask are, you know, do they have due process before putting a student in a virtual placement in particular? I don't know many folks that have that. Do they have a way to appeal? I think most of our districts do, but I don't know where that stands today in some of them. Do they require hearings on the 10th day? Do they voluntarily consider homeless status and trauma before removal? And how do they sort of proceduralize it? So those are a few key questions that if you wanted to go to a school board meeting, or if you just are friends with a school board member and can ask them to look into these things. And I'm happy to share, we wrote a letter and sent it to the 50, I hate this, the way this sounds, but the 50 worst school districts in the state for their discipline rate for homeless students. And there wasn't anyone in Washtenaw County that was on that list, thankfully. I hope, because we've been here since 1975, so that'd be pretty depressing if we were in that list, but that doesn't mean we don't have work to do. But there's definitely our neighbors in Wayne County and lots of other places. There was some extreme examples in the top 50, Jackson. So we kind of sent them a letter with recommendations of things to look at. So happy to share that if folks want. So that's sort of like, if you want to do something local, these are some questions you might want to ask. And I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to do that and just see what other questions there are. And if we have time, I'm happy to.
Three more questions in the chat.
Where do teachers and administrators stand on consistent use of restorative practices? I'm probably not the best person to ask that question. Yeah, I'm not. You need to ask them that question. I know that it feels like one of the things we hear sometimes is that it doesn't always feel like there's enough time, and that they're asked to do too many things. And so I think that that is real. And we do ask, like, I wish we could all slow down and like not be so worried about cramming like all these standards, but maybe that sounds like I'm a terrible person. I'm just saying, like, especially after the last year and a half, like, do we need to slow down a little bit and spend some time building relationships? Because in the end, you actually learn faster than if you just ignore that stuff and try to cram things down people's throat. It's kind of counterintuitive, but so I think it's that worry about, am I going to have enough time to get to all the content I need to get to, without always understanding that slowing down actually helps you get through the content in a different way. So that's probably the best answer I can say. A few weeks ago, we were honored by AFT Michigan, which I know our founder Ruth was pretty shocked by, because I think in her days, sometimes we were considered pretty adversarial with school folks sometimes. And but one of our deepest values as an organization is collaboration. We want public schools to be vibrant and strong. We don't want our teachers, many who are my friends, my family, we don't want them to be working to exhaustion. We want them to feel supportive. And so how do we reimagine what our schools look like, where our students feel heard and safe, and also our teachers feel heard and safe? And I think restorative practices is a way to build that connection. So I have a hard time like forcing people to do restorative practices. You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like you should want to do it. Like I do it in my home with my kids. So I don't know. But it's a great tool. What do you think about school safety officers? I'm deeply opposed to them. I could go into that more if you want me to, but that's the quick answer. And SAC is opposed to them, and our students are opposed to them. Is not.
May I ask a question about process? Do you have an office in the Ypsi schools somewhere, or do you have to have students referred to you, or you seek them out, or the parents come to you? I'm not sure how the process works.
Oh, both, all of the above. Yeah, we try to be super accessible. So families can call us directly on our helpline, and often they get referrals from other families, but sometimes through the schools. Our Check and Connect mentors, I don't know, it depends on the year. Some of the schools do give them an office. So when they have a private place to meet with students. So our Check and Connect mentors are in Ypsilanti schools, Lincoln schools, and Cody High School in Detroit, if you're familiar, and Covenant House Southwest, which is in Southwest Detroit and serves primarily older youth. Many have been expelled. It's kind of like considered like a last chance school. So those are the schools we have Check and Connect, and those we have MOUs with those school districts. We only accept referrals. It's not quite that simple, but we primarily accept referrals from those school districts, as well as community mental health and the court system for that program. So you couldn't just call us and be like, I want to be in Check and Connect. Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated, but our advocates, you could just call. Yeah.
I see Lynn has her hand up, and
Yeah.
there's another chat question.
Lynn, you want to go ahead, and then I'll
Yeah,
go to
Peri, thanks. One question I had, because I'm not familiar enough with the legislation that we've been talking a little bit about. Is there funding or resources for more bodies, for specifically for schools who are really on the line in terms of what they have to spend for rural schools, some of these schools that just don't have access to personnel that could help with implementing restorative justice in their systems?
So our bills shouldn't require any other. Give me a minute to respond. So
Okay.
Our specific bills wouldn't require additional staffing. Like what we're codifying what Goss versus Lopez, which is a Supreme Court decision, like already says they should be doing. It's just like making it really clear. The bills that happened 5 years ago, which require lesser interventions, which require restorative practices, they probably should have allocated funding, and they did not. And
Okay.
so as a separate issue, we are working quite heavily with this coalition of grassroots organizations around the state around school funding and equitable school funding for these very reasons, and trying to advocate for mental health support and services. And the governor's budget actually had quite a few provisions. I'm not sure where we stand at this moment. So absolutely, like it's both and, like we aren't adequately funding our schools, period, and especially at the levels that they would need to be able to adequately respond to the mental health needs during a pandemic. So we've been really advocating hard for that, but I hope that kind of distinguishes our specific set of bills shouldn't require any additional staffing other than what the bills 5 years ago that passed do. So of course we need to advocate, and we are.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does. I know you've mentioned already that, teachers are under an enormous amount of pressure to do everything for society. So that's
They
my
are.
little perspective in terms of they all want to do what's best, but it's just really hard when you're
Mhm.
kind of on your own.
But I do think it's interesting that districts that haven't necessarily gotten more funding have been able to hire these different staff members and do things. So it's really about what are you prioritizing? Still inadequate. Still, we need to all be, I think, looking at why is Michigan continuing to fall down in terms of achievement compared to our states? I know we're trying to increase investment, but we continue to have pretty unequitable and inadequate funding for our public schools, in my opinion. So,
Mhm.
and in many people's opinions. Yeah, so we do need to work on that for sure. All right, there was one other question in the chat. This is not about expulsions or suspensions. You're also wondering about police involvement in schools. Yes, I think that that's quite concerning. And we were part of an effort in IPSI to and successfully advocated that police be removed from the schools. We just had so many situations that our young people shared where they were feeling surveilled. And if you've had bad experience with police and you show up, I live on the street that IPSI High is. Every time you would walk by, there would be a police car like in the front. That's a way to start your day, is to walk right by law enforcement immediately. So our young people felt pretty strongly about that, and that was successfully removed. I've had to, in expulsion hearings, I've had to ask for an officer to leave because anything that they say can and will be held against them in a legal system. And I just feel bad for families who don't have an advocate and don't know that they can ask for that person to leave. I was told a few years ago in Saline that too bad, they're not going to leave, and we had to make a decision, and we decided to stay. The family decided to stay, even though I felt very uncomfortable about that. So I don't know if Saline, and Milan, they might still have police in their schools. I thought Dexter did. There's so many problematic stories. And you know what, here's what I'll say. If you guys like John Oliver, if you don't mind swearing, he just did a wonderful whole piece about police in schools that encapsulates everything that I think about it. So if you don't mind, a few F-bombs, like check out John Oliver's recent school policing.
Jane has her hand up, and I just want to mention in the chat, the Washtenaw Regional Organizing Coalition last month had 4 public sessions, and Peri with Jeff Irwin made a similar presentation to today's presentation. So if you want to get your friends to have this message, you can go to the WIROC site. Jane has her hand up.
I simply am floored by how wonderful this hour has been, Peri. I thank you so much. I totally believe that this is no way to treat a child. And I wish that were my phrase, but I borrowed it. I really feel strongly about teacher in service. And I know that some teachers have an inkling of what restorative practices might be about, or they might have an idea, or they think they know a lot about it, but they might not have a picture of how it will work for them in their classroom or with a dispute that needs to be resolved before a kid is suspended. So my goal and my thrust in life is to work toward more instructive programs, I might say, for teachers. And I think in service is one way to go about it. I don't know the process at the IPSI schools, but I think I'm working toward that. Do you know anyone that is in charge of that? I would think the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, Carlos, might be a place to start.
Yeah, I would probably start with Carlos for sure. And I don't know who's been doing their training, because I know that they've had some different folks. I will say, I just want to add this to your comment. We have I think it's on our website, but it's the continuum I think sometimes when we say restorative practices, people automatically jump to like that really formal offender, circle or whatever, which is great and it has its place. But if you go to the other side of that continuum of services, it's just 5 questions, or it's even less than that, right? There's questions that you can ask, and to me, it's a way of life. It's like building relationships, and not equating a young person with their behavior, and like being able to separate them and to give them an opportunity to repair. So I'm like, if you can't, and it is hard at the high school level to like, I think Pathways does circles like every Monday and Friday. They were for a while. Harder in high school. I got that. But like, you have time to ask a student like some reflective questions, right? Like, I noticed that this happened, like, can you apologize and ask how you can, make that up to that student? Like, there's just ways to do it that aren't super time consuming. Just wanted to add that, sorry. Did Donna have her hand raised?
Yeah, just to add more complexity to the situation, I sat there and thought about looking at this as a systems problem, and going back to Eastern Michigan that has a great, education program for teachers. Why is this not maybe taught as they are going through as freshmen and all the way through their senior year? I know businesses use this. I used this 20 years ago at Ford Motor Company. We sat in circles before any meeting started, with a koosh ball in our hand and passed it around so people knew how they were feeling. And I just look at everything now kind of in a systems way, and all the way through the educational process, and especially for teachers who are learning how to be teachers. Think about how effective that would be if they all marched into schools with that kind of activity in their brain on how to deal with kids.
100%. And if you think like, isn't our job as adults, or our job is to prepare young people for like vibrant life,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And so like we want them, well, first of all, we want them to make mistakes when they're younger so that we can help them. Because I don't know about y'all, but the times I've learned the most has been when I've messed up, honestly. Like when I reflect back, my mistakes is where I wish that wasn't the case. I kind of beat myself up sometimes, but we want them to make mistakes then, and then we want to give them the environment to learn and to repair and to learn and grow. And so it is quite disconcerting, and sometimes I get discouraged because, especially when it comes to Black and brown kids, we don't seem to want to treat them as children. We call, I had an 18-year-old young person who was killed this year that I'd worked with for 4 years, and I remember the headline was Ypsilanti man killed. And just a few months later, an Ann Arbor 18-year-old was killed, and they said an Ann Arbor teen was killed. And this is what I mean, like just right here in our own community, the way we treat Black and brown youth, especially from Ypsilanti, is disgusting. And we have to disrupt those narratives, and remember that they are children. Their brains aren't fully developed. They got some learning to do. And so how do we create systems that allow them to make mistakes and learn from them and repair the harm and move on, and care for the adults who are caring.
For a study group on juvenile justice, it's so clear to me that what happens in the schools is an integral part of what happens in the juvenile justice system. And so, Peri, as always, this has been a fabulous amount of information. And Marianne, we're past our time, but if you've got something really quick.
Okay, really quick. Friends of Restorative Justice, as some of you know, is really working hard with the county commissioners to establish a Center for Restorative Justice. And one of the things that Belinda Doolin and I and others have talked about is in-service, establishing a whole in-service program for educators. So it kind of combines Jane, but it gives it a home, and DRC with others will develop that program.
Oh, keep it up. That's great.
Yeah.
Let me turn it back to Jane to tell us about next month's meeting.
Well, I'll turn it over to Susan to tell us about next meeting.
Really quickly, we invite you to come back on July 6th at 9 o'clock, when we'll have a presentation from the prosecutor of Washtenaw County's office, the Juvenile Court Division Chief Assistant Prosecuting Attorney, Victoria Burton Harris,
and her colleague, the assistant prosecuting attorney, Allison Robbins, who supports the diversion deflection efforts in Washtenaw County. And we've asked them to come and talk about their policies and procedures. And I've put my email address in the, it's not going, I don't know why. Anyway, we'll send out my email address because we welcome your questions. Some idea of what the interest is in the group and how to address what your concerns. So we'll send out my email address, and then I'll forward them to Ms. Burton Harris and Ms. Robbins. So that's me.
Jane, thank you for chairing this group. Thanks to everyone for coming today, and Peri,
Yeah,
fabulous amount of information.
wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was just great.
Oh, thank you so much.